Hello and welcome everyone to the third edition of Ananke's Women in Literature Festival. It is an absolute honor to welcome my distinguished panelists. Hello and welcome. Sorry about that. It wasn't muted. As I was saying, welcome everyone. Hammad, May, Naima, Jayson. This session is titled The Migratory Experience of Language. And with this, I'll hand over the proverbial mic to Hammad. Over to you, Hammad.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Thank you for inviting me to host this. It's an absolute pleasure today to host this panel on the migratory experience of language as part of the Ananke Women in Literature Festival. And I've got a panel of distinguished writers and scholars whom I'll introduce now. We have Jayson Iwen. Jayson Iwen's book, Rose and Blood, won the 2020 Miller-Williams Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the National Poetry Series. His other published books are Dick, Gnarly Wounds, a momentary joke book, and 6 Trips in 2 Directions. He co-translated Lebanese poet Jawdat Fakhreddin's Lighthouse for the Drowning and Kurdish-Syrian writer Salim Barakat's Come Take a Gentle Stab. His poetry, prose, and translations have appeared in many journals, including Cream, City Review, Fans, New American Writing, Nimrod, Painted Bride Quarterly, Pleiades, Tikkun, Waterstone Review, and World Literature Today. He lives and works in the Twin Ports. Thank you very much and welcome, Jayson. AlNakib. AlNakib is author of the novel An Unlasting Home and the short story collection The Hidden Light of Objects, winner of the Edinburgh International Book Festival's first book award in 2014. Her fiction has been published in Ninth Letter, The First Line, After the Pause, and the Markaz Review. Her essays have appeared in World Literature Today, Blob, blog of the LA Review of Books, and the BBC World Service, among others. She's Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Kuwait University. Welcome, May. And we have Naima Rashid with us. Naima Rashid is an author, poet, and literary translator. Her work was longlisted for National Poetry Competition 2019 and Best Small Fictions 2022. Her published and forthcoming books include Summer Worlds from Yoda Press, Nola Ki Koti from Penguin Random House India, Chicanes from Le Fugitive, and Defiance of the Rose from Oxford University Press. Her writings have been widely published in journals of repute, including Asymptote, The Scores, Wild Court, Poetry Birmingham, RISC Journal, and Litero, among others. She's a collaborator with the UK-based translation collective Shadow Heroes, which teaches young people to embrace all aspects of their linguistic and cultural heritage. Thank you very much, Naima, for joining us today. Welcome. So, as we said, today's session is on the migratory experience of language. João Guimarães Rosa says so beautifully that every word has its shadow. Taking cue from the Brazilian novelist Exposition, this session will delve into the migratory experience of language through translation and interpretation, a journey that storytelling embarks on from a deep sense of loss, the loss that occurs not only as a result of linguistic repression due to, among other things, hyper-nationalist fascism, but also through the spatial dislocation of form and language. The conversation will also focus on the story's passage from loss to shelter, from the notions of banishment and ostracism vis-a-vis the prospects and potential of gentrification and victimhood. Moving the discussion even further, the session will probe into the paradigmatic shift from methodological nationalism to methodological transnationalism, which weaves an intricate tapestry of inheritance and refuge, also that of emancipation, and to quote from Imaginary Homeland by Rashid, the notion that something can also be gained. So we've got quite a lot to unpack. So my first question would be to each of you, if you could say a few words on today's theme, perhaps, and we'll start with Jayson.
Good morning and afternoon, everybody. So yeah, I wanted to share my, in relation to this topic, my conviction that not only is the act of translation migratory, but our own identities are as well. That every role we play presents us with a different script. Every language that we speak presents us with a different worldview. And that this is something to be celebrated, really. It's been even studied that people even remember their own personal experiences differently when they're speaking in different languages. They'll literally have new memories will present themselves based on the linguistic lens that they're looking at their own life through. So we're constantly translating ourselves from moment to moment, from venue to venue, from social group to social group, from role to role, whether we're a mother or a daughter or a sister or a lover, we are speaking ourselves in a different language in a sense. Also, just wanted to kind of put forth that a lot of our conflicts that we encounter are the results of people feeling that their identities are being attacked, and they often react adversely to an even greater degree to the extent that they feel they're being attacked, even when the people that they're counter-identifying with share many other identities with them. So it's something that I've been looking at a lot more recently in my own writing, my own thinking, that it's so important to always look at the identities of the other and recognize what you share with them, and to translate yourself essentially into that role, just to remember what is shared as well as what is different between these identities. So that was, in a nutshell, kind of how I was thinking about the prompt that we were given. And I will.
Thank you very much, Jayson. Had some very interesting thoughts there, and we'll come back to them shortly. May.
Hi there. So, the title and brief got me thinking about words as shelter. And so I wrote down a few things because it really did make me think about how I feel on this. And my novel, An Unlasting Home, in it, the protagonist, Sarah, is a philosophy professor at Kuwait University, and she's been accused of blasphemy under this new law designating it a capital crime. And as she awaits trial, she looks back, tracking her personal narrative, the stories of two generations of women who shaped her, and along with that, the history of her country. So it's for words that Sarah is facing the threat of execution, and through words that she finds shelter. So we live in this world where the stakes of language seem to be rising ever higher. Words can hurt and heal, they cancel and forgive, threaten and promise, control and invent. Words can be used against us, and we can use words to save ourselves from injustice. Words can be made to experiment, challenge, and to create alternative visions and possibilities. They can be used to reflect or invent ugly, or the ugly and the beautiful. So there's no end to what words can do. And I've always believed that it's not our role as writers or readers or leaders or politicians or parents or teachers, media pundits or whatever else, to enforce the limits on the wild ramblings and unruly meanderings of language. So these wild and unruly practices of writing can be considered migratory, shifting stable and conventional expressions into the realm of experimentation and the imagination, in other words, into the domain of art. So one might describe this shift produced by language as a form of transmutation, a translation of the ordinary into the extraordinary, of the mundane humdrum into the delirious flights of fancy. So language experiments can extricate us out of our comfortable identities and platforms into something unfamiliar, offering us experiences, sensations, and perceptions we might not otherwise be privy to or even have any desire to access. And it is this, I think, especially that stories do best. So if we allow ourselves to be captured by them, they can propel us into the unknown. So then I was also thinking, I wouldn't be surprised if people say, so why in these terrible days of uncertainty should I want art to thrust me further into the unknown and the uncertain? Why on earth should I need to inhabit through art any undesirable, uncomfortable, even loathsome positions or points of view? And I would respond because so much of what we're immersed in today by way of social media or streamed media, mainstream films and books and so on, takes the shape of the contrived and the homogeneous, whatever is most conducive to marketing and sales. So our preferences quickly become algorithmic, and safe in our silos, we escape feeling awkward or out of place in our cultural encounters. Yet it is precisely in these inconvenient, strange, small, or overlooked cultural spaces that the possibility of new ideas and new understandings are born, and through them, new realities can potentially materialize, though there's never any guarantee. And so then I also started thinking about how, we're shifting into this era of artificial intelligence, and it's on the cusp of kind of taking over our words, accrued over millennia. And we are in a position whereby these things are going to loosen irreversibly humanity's hold on language and narrative. And so I imagine a world in which all of human production is mashed together and regurgitated at an exponentially faster rate and wider range than it is already. And as a writer, I wonder whether this signals the end of words as shelter and of storytelling as our shared human response to the uncertainty of the universe. I also wonder at times with trepidation what will be allowed to take its place. Groomed on mind-numbingly uniform social media, algorithms, and AI, what will humans even be capable of producing in a language colonized by these technological forces? More of the same, perhaps. So we stand at the brink of an epistemic shift beyond which I really can't quite see. On good days, I believe we will continue to tell stories in ways altered, maybe diminished, maybe enhanced by technology. And who knows, perhaps weary of the technology we're currently so enamored with, we will turn once again to the shelter of language, which will continue to serve us as we have served it since time immemorial.
Thank you very much, mate. And over to you, Naima, please.
So while agreeing with what Jayson and Mai have said, I would like to zoom in and sort of introduce two further dimensions to it. When I read the brief and the theme for the panel, I think what struck me most were two aspects, really. One was that for me and for most translators, home is something that you find in between worlds. While I was living in Pakistan, I wasn't speaking or reading or listening in the languages which were supposed to be my mother tongues, Urdu and Punjabi. I spent all my time studying and learning French and English. So I was conversant in those languages. It was only when I left the country that I grew more attached to the languages I had left behind. So there are two dimensions here, really. For me, translation, the act of translation, the act of braiding meaning between two languages and, that liminal space between two defined worlds, which is a gray space, that has always felt like home. And that echoes the fact that for most writers, for most translators who live in between worlds, home is not a place or one language. Home is a state of being. Home is something they create and they carry within them all the time. And then linked to this is the notion that when there's, when you leave a country behind and you move to another country, there's a particular angle to your departure, which has an element of betrayal, which has an element of rupture. And so you can't translate or talk about the language that you left behind, the literature that you left behind, without this permanent sense of nostalgia or loss. So when you've left behind a home, you've left behind a language, you've left behind a culture, and you're trying to make home or create home in a new language, in a new culture. So in a way, you are really always negotiating and recreating or finding parts of your identity that you've lost. And you're not just doing it through language, you're doing it through language, music, food, art, because all the things which you took for granted while you lived in your first home, you can't take them for granted anymore. So the meaning that they have in your life and the way they define you, it changes completely. And as a translator, then you're forever negotiating that, because you suddenly realize that there was an attachment with all those markers of home, which you were, blind to, which you took for granted because you were busy with life. And it's like this joke. When you live in a city, you don't visit all the touristic spots because you're like, oh, I live here. I can visit anytime. But then a lifetime goes by and you never actually get to visit them. So I feel there's this extra element of nostalgia and loss in your active translation when you're not living in the country whose language, in your home country. And so, yeah, it's not just about language. It's about an element. It's an amalgam of so many things like music, etc. So for me, translation does not mean a literary activity anymore like it used to when I lived in Pakistan. It means something else altogether. I'm thinking about the legacy I'm leaving behind for my son. I'm thinking about what I could do for Urdu, because there's so few people in the world doing it. There are all these dimensions which have come into my active translation, and I would say it's a kind of activism, it's a kind of passion, it's a kind of thing I'm taking a stand for. It's not just playing around with words. Perhaps it never really was.
Thank you very much, Naima. That was very relatable for me as well, being a diaspora writer. And I would like to explore some of the ideas that you just talked about first shortly. But coming back to you, Jayson, you said that translation is something we all do as part of how we engage with our identities and the world around us, essentially. If we look at this concept, the word itself, in some other cultures, in some other languages, for example, the Turkish word for translation, çevirmek, is to rotate, from which incidentally the word shawarma also comes from. And that kind of, this transformation or the metamorphosis becomes a bit more clearer than, for example, the term we are more used to, more accustomed to, the English term translation, which is bearing across from its Latin root. I would like to ask specifically in relation to translating literary texts from across cultures and borders, what sort of migratory shifts do you think a translator experiences?
I think of it as acting in a sense, and I mean like professional acting, where you have to get yourself in character. You have to try to figure out what the character is, which is the poem or the story. What is this character? What's the essentially kind of the personality, the attitude, the philosophy that's lurking behind it, and then to try to get into that character, to take on that mindset. And that for me is the most important part of translation, more so than looking for linguistic equivalents or it's more about becoming someone else, not assuming this other person, but it's like a sort of the attitude of the work itself, trying to become the work in a sense, so that you you have that attitude. It's really all about attitude. So when I was helping to translate, because I'm not fluent in Arabic to any means by any means, but Jawdat Fakhruddin and Salim Barakat, very different people. I've had the pleasure of meeting one of them in person, but I just knew they were extremely different characters, and it was my job to try to honor that personality. And then the words, they kind of solve themselves, once you understand the attitude. So for me, that's the way that I work, and that's the kind of translation process, or the migration is kind of, like I said earlier, migration of the self, from a point, kind of like Naima was saying, of this kind of gray, like the days that we're all experiencing right now, like literally, the gray, overcast place we call home, which is between real places, and we need to identify where they are and go inhabit those, and then return back to our, the womb of words, maybe I'll say.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea about disguising yourself, or maybe adapting yourself in another role as an actor. That's a very interesting idea about being a translator. Thank you, Jayson. Coming back to you, I would like to ask whether the threat of words you talked about earlier could be a result of a misinterpretation of texts generally thought to be sacred in religious systems, but also some other, established norms or notions. And it's very something what you were talking about earlier about the protagonist of your novel facing this fate, this sentence. It's very relatable coming from Pakistan. When I was growing up there, I saw that quite a lot. There was a blasphemy law in Pakistan. There still is a blasphemy law in Pakistan, which was first established for political gains more than anything else. And even now, it's usually used or abused for the same sort of, political or personal interests. And we see similar sort of things, the shutting of voices on social media, or in other forms, in other platforms as well, when we see this censor culture, or cancel culture, rather, being very dominant in these days. I would like to ask you a little bit more about that. What do you think about the reasons behind these, maybe, what's the cause of all this thing?
So the reasons behind them are complex, but one thing that we need to kind of get a sense of is that any text, sacred or otherwise, will always be open to interpretation. Misinterpretation, different interpretation depends on, where you're positioned, if you're going to see it as a misinterpretation or the correct interpretation. But as long as it's written, as long as it's textual, it's open to that kind of ambiguity. And that's as old as, texts have been around. We can read and read them in different ways. I happen to think that that's the magic of writing, that the thing that it can do is to allow itself to be interpreted over time. The meanings change depending on where it's positioned, when, who's doing the reading. But of course, at the same time, that's also where the danger or the risk comes in, and where, depending on who's reading it and for what political reasons, as you've said, or social, or a sense of, a sense of one's identity. One of the reasons can be that people's identity feels threatened. which I can understand. I have sympathy for that, of course. Words can be injurious, words can be painful, they can cause harm, and so on. And at the same time, my sense is that leaving that space open for the possibility of reading in the misreading, whatever it might be, because you always have the possibility of using your own words to counter what you are seeing as a misinterpretation. So in this part of the world where we can say, okay, this is blasphemous, this is offensive, or whatever it happens to be, I don't see, or elsewhere too, even in the West, I mean, we see that, it's read in this way that's saying, okay, let's open it up to reading it, and then say in this part of the world, we take offense. But my sense is that we also have the power to use those words to counter whatever it is that we don't like and challenge those interpretations rather than canceling or making arguments of, now you're going to prison for what you've just said. I mean, this is maybe perhaps an idealistic way of looking at things. It's not the way the world works, but I don't like the direction that it's going for me as a writer. I want the words to be free, even if they cause harm in a sense, because then you can use those words to challenge that harm. I don't know if that is a precise enough response, but
yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that. And I agree that instead of shutting down these voices, we should use our own voice, or these voices can be used to challenge words or other voices. So yeah, thank you for that. Naima, we talked about a legacy, and I really like that idea about that. Especially as a diaspora writer, you feel like you have a sort of a responsibility or an onus to leave a legacy, of your home language or languages. And this may be a bit, I don't know, because I struggle with this idea as well quite a lot. I think about it quite a lot as well. Why do you think, if you want to do something for Urdu or Punjabi, why do you think translating works from Urdu is the maybe, I don't know, is the best way rather than writing in Urdu, let's say, for example?
Because it would, quite simply, Hammad, because, we have a legacy of colonization. I mean, we grew up not reading in Urdu. In the school libraries, I was reading in French and English, and we were encouraged to do that. So there was this sense of denial of what was truly ours. And I think there is the reason why, I mean, ideally, yes, ideally, the best thing would be to write in Urdu and to get an entire generation excited about Urdu and have them reconnect with Urdu. But I think you have to do it in a phased way, because there's a huge percentage of the population who wants to read Urdu, but they were not taught to read Urdu. They were not taught to love Urdu. So I'm saying that quite simply because I'm being realistic here. And when I was growing up, I wanted to read and appreciate Urdu, but those languages, there was shame, or there wasn't pride around those languages, and the pride was instead for languages, English and French and all. So we grew up mastering them and speaking them as if they were our own languages. And so really, I think translating those works in English is just a phased approach that I'm taking. Ideally, yes, it would be to write in Urdu or to have people read directly in Urdu. And let me state here, for avoidance of doubt, there is no substitute for reading in the language. There's really no substitute in reading in the own language. But the next best thing is translation. And there's something I would like to add to what Jayson said about the process of translation. And, it got me thinking that when we say migratory experience of language, I'm thinking about the process of translation, the act of translation, and the collaboration between the translator and the text, or the author, or the culture, or the language from which he's translating. And my experience has been that the migratory experience of translation can actually be, in a way, migrating out of your own body. And, it can be like putting yourself in another person's shoes. But for that, the translation of the project has to be conceived and acted upon in a certain way. And in a recent experience translating this humongous project for which, Hammad, I did consult you on a couple of points as well. It was this vast project, and I realized at one point that it was talking about a culture which I was familiar with, but I needed to consult with the author and I needed to get very deep into the nuances because I didn't want to strike an off note when the characters are speaking in vernacular. What's the level of humor that they're going to? Is it classy? Is it crude? So I wanted to strike the right note. And when I made up my mind to do that, and I got in touch with the author, it basically added an entire year to the project because we realized that we needed to do this work because I was getting insights that I wasn't able to get on my own. I knew the culture, I had read, but the author had a grassroots level of understanding, which in all honesty, it was a very humbling experience because I had to say to myself, you know what, there is no way I can do this on my own without the input from the author. And so I asked him, I said, I think we need to do another year of talking, of, exchanges. So for one whole year, we went back and forth speaking almost every day for like 3-4 hours. And I feel that without that layer, the translation could never have been good enough. But what I see is that because of the demands of the publishing world, the way translations are done and the standard procedure for translation is that the translator gets the copy of the book. And after that, they don't really feel the need to speak to the author, and there's generally no consultation, no correspondence, and the author just sees the published translation in the other language. And I've had a lot of friends whose novels have been who've been translated in different languages, and they were never consulted. And I'm okay. I don't want to use the word consult, but like there's got to be this collaboration because what Jayson said was, I think what you said, Jayson, was pointing towards the humility of the translator, not assuming anything. I feel that if you're honest with yourself and humble as a translator, at some point, you will have to say that, okay, this is where my knowledge and my understanding ends. Anything beyond this is assumption. All right, I'm going to park my ego and I need to speak to the author. And without that happening, I feel that, I don't know, I struggle to imagine how a translation could be honest.
I do think of it as an art too, though. But like acting, there's endless ways to be Hamlet, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely an art that you have to. The translator honors the author, the intent, but at the same time, I feel it really needs to be almost a new work of art in the target language.
Definitely, it's a new work, and I agree with Naima on that. Recently, I translated something by Naveen Kishore, his poetry debut, Knotted Grief, into Urdu. And from the beginning, we thought it as a collaboratory sort of a process, and I consulted him many times during the process, especially when I wasn't 100% sure about his vision. So I think sometimes it's very important to understand the vision of the writer when they wrote down something, because sometimes there could be cultural things, obviously, but there could be some personal things that as well, which are, I think, very important to understand. And going back to my earlier point about legacy, and I just want to clarify that that's something that I think about quite a lot. So I thought I should get your perspective on that as well, because just how you said that, growing up in Pakistan and many other, people from other colonial former colonies would have similar experiences where home languages, or reading in home languages is discouraged and thought to be, as you said, something related to shame or, that sort of thing. And reading in English and French is, on the other hand, considered something to be like way forward or something. I was doing similar sort of things, but I wanted to hear your perspective on that. And as we're talking about, various sorts of challenges that a translator may experience, I would like to ask both Jayson and Naima about any particular challenges that you face, as a translator, especially between languages and cultures which are so different. Like, for example, I just mentioned Naveen Kishore's work, along with the challenges, for example, where I was trying to gain his vision. There were also differences between the syntax between Urdu and English, and I'm not sure if that's the case with prose as well, because this was a poetry collection. But in poetry, especially, there's a lot of there could be syntactical differences. So I would like to ask both of you about your thoughts on that. Any challenges that you face particularly?
Naima, you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Jayson.
My challenge was just Salim Barakat. His style is just so I've never seen anything like it before, and I'm told it's in Arabic. There's nothing like it either, which is why he was not translated into English until Huda and I got to work on it. So yeah, and honestly, it was sometimes when I looked at the poetry, the first Huda would present me with a literal translation, with oftentimes a lot of footnotes involved, and sometimes I would read them and I would I think it made no sense. I mean, I was like, oh my God, if people see this, they're going to think it's bad poetry. But this guy, I know he's a genius, so this can't be bad poetry. And my challenge was, I kind of had to, even though he's not a postmodernist, that's not a thing with him, but I kind of had to go there, and sort of call upon a tradition that I'm familiar with from my own culture to try to kind of make sense of what he was doing. And so that was my solution, sort of, was American postmodernism applied to Salim Barakat's very unique voice. And, myself too. I think I like to think of myself as an equal partner, because you need to have that kind of confidence when you're tackling someone, a work like that. Otherwise, you'll be completely destroyed by it.
Definitely. I agree with that. And it's interesting. And was it also, was Salim's bilingual or multilingual sort of background, because he speaks Kurdish as well, was it also did it also contribute to being so complex?
I think so. He's fascinated with linguistics, so he's doing a lot of stuff in the Arabic that he's twisting, and he's pulling it to the point of nearly breaking. So there's a lot of very strange. Huda explained this to me, because I obviously couldn't see it, but that's where some of the strangeness comes from, was the just stretching the boundaries of the language in a way that made it just seem very strange, particularly strange in a literal translation.
Fascinating. Thank you, Jayson.
So for me, I would say the biggest challenge is usually around, there's a voice, there's the authorial voice, and then within that, there are different tones, there are different beats. So for me, I think the biggest challenge is getting the tone exactly right, first in the original, then in the translation, because as I said, there are these nuances that you have to calibrate. If, for example, it's a lowly person speaking in a very crude manner, you can't translate it into refined English. It will be very off, and vice versa. So that's but in order to get the tone right, you need to do a lot of research and a lot of thinking and understanding which goes beyond language. For example, you need to understand the politics. You need to understand the social configuration of the relationship. You need to understand the background of the character. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, and you can finally nail the tone. And in this example that I just shared, where the last year we were, the author Natik and I, we were speaking almost every day. I felt that if the translation had gone out without that year, that would have ended my career as a translator, to put it shortly. So at a very superficial level, Hammad, I felt the translating from Urdu and Punjabi, and there's a lot of challenge around converting the books or the projects conceived in Urdu and Punjabi and printed and published in Urdu and Punjabi for an English-speaking audience. For example, I feel that the editorial controls and the editorial standards needs to be reimagined for an English-speaking audience. As a small example, for Nolaki Koti, which is a massive work, I thought it made a lot of sense to introduce chapter titles, which were not given in the original. So I felt that was a nice touch. Similarly, I feel that in many parts, the dates could have been mentioned on under the chapter titles, which they weren't, and it spans the time, the 20, 30 years before partition, straight up to the 80s. So just those small milestones for the reader to guide the journey. That's a very superficial level of, the challenges that you can, and which are nonetheless part of the translation, because you're translating it for a different audience. And so it needs to appeal to them and make sense to them.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Thank you, Naima. And coming back to you, Mai, you talked about words, and in a way, this is it's a revolution for words. We are seeing words everywhere. Everyone has a voice, and they can gain many audiences, across different platforms. But we also talked about the dangers, the threats in words. And although I agree with you on the idea that we shouldn't be shutting down voices, but freedom of speech itself, it can be a dangerous thing. Do you think there should be any limits, some limits maybe, to control voices from going it completely, unbridled, let's say?
It's such a hard question, and that's something often my students bring up as well, especially living in this part of the world where it's always easy to say, we want, there have to be limits. We talk about it here in Kuwait as the red line. That line, that word seems to come up here in this part of the world, the red line. For me, if words incite violence, for me, that's the limit. That is the place where the line comes down. If words are inciting violence against others, if they're creating or instigating that, that's the limit. But it's hard, it's hard to decide. You don't want you don't like the idea, obviously, if you are an ethical person, of words being used to hurt or harm others. But I'm always I'm always sort of wary of making claims and decisions about where that line should be or what it is. But for the moment, I can say that the question of, the possibility of violence, words inciting violence, is where the line might be drawn.
I assume you mean physical violence?
Physical violence.
Okay.
Physical violence. Yes. Thank you for asking for the clarification, because of course, I know that words are injurious. I know that they can cause emotional damage of all sorts. So it becomes difficult, and I'm, it's hard for me to say, but I think that that's where I would put down the line. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was a very well articulated answer to admittedly difficult question. So we are coming to the end of this very riveting discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining and for sharing your thoughts today. And I really enjoyed it, and hopefully the audiences too. I'll hand over to Sabine now to conclude.
We have a question from Maria Maurice. If you'd like to take that.
What's the best way to undo the damage caused by disowning the mother tongue, Urdu in my case? And it's not just the language, it is the identity and direction of the readers as well. There's this uncertainty and lack of ownership of heritage associated with it. That's for everyone.
I'm going to just quickly jump in. I write in English and I write it in the Middle East. So for me, it isn't a question of disowning Arabic, which many people own. It's a language I care about. But again, as Naima says, for reasons that have to do with the history of Kuwait and the history of where I'm located and family history, English was my first language. I'm embedded in Arabic, I care about Arabic, but English was my first language. And so I feel very comfortable about writing in English and writing Arab literature in English. And I don't think it's going to harm Arabic or the heritage of Arabic literature that some Arab writers choose to write in English or French. I think that it's actually enriching the culture and specifically here in this part of the world, because of course, Arab Americans in the US will use English and it makes a certain kind of sense. But I think here in this location, to claim English and to put it to work in ways that are inventive, perhaps, doing something slightly different than the colonial language that was imposed in various places is interesting, and I think that it isn't necessarily damaging.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, I mean, this is something that's been going on for a very long time. For example, from a South Asian perspective, English, for example, is now the cultural language. But before that, there was also Persian, which was also sort of an outsider language. But a lot of very famous South Asian writers chose to write in Persian for both personal and also, they wanted to gain wider audience across the border, and that's a legitimate choice. And while doing that, while writing, for example, in another language, they're still, adding to the heritage and culture of that language, as you said, Mai. Would anyone else like to add anything?
Yeah, I would just like to say that I loved the point that Mai made, because that is so true. I'm not sure that I had said it that way in my mind or understood it that way in my mind, but that's exactly it. Because of the history of our countries, we are very comfortable writing in English. That's a fact. Why should we pretend otherwise? Why should we not use this? And I remember that when I write my own fiction, I never feel that I'm writing English, or I feel that I'm writing Urdu literature in English. And for me, the best compliment from a reader would be if they read it and they say, I feel I'm reading Urdu literature in English. That's really, so yeah, I completely respect and understand that perspective. And I think that's a great way to look at it. Another small point is in response to Madiha's question that I'm not going to use the word should, but I'm just going to speak from the point of what I'm actually doing to make up for the sense of loss that I feel towards Urdu. I can no longer watch or read in English and French. And it's like this belated homecoming where half of my life was spent only reading, watching, listening, writing in English and French. And now I'm only doing it in Urdu. So I don't know, it's nature's revenge or something.
I would add that if you feel you've disowned it, you can always re-own it, repossess the language and read it, speak it, write in it. Where I am right now, I teach at a school that is on land it's the ancestral land of the Ojibwe people, or the Anishinaabe. And so that language has been, it's coming back from a moribund state. And as a member of a department that teaches languages, we've been supporting the instructors on campus who teach Anishinaabe, the language of the Ojibwe. And it's been, they've been getting a lot more support from the university recently. And it's really heartening to see the students who are studying it for the first time, how excited they are. and they're indigenous students who've, their great grandparents may have spoken the language, but their parents didn't really. They only spoke English. And it's like witnessing a renaissance, really, at the very beginning. It's very exciting. So it can be done with a language that was nearly wiped out by colonizers.
Yeah, definitely. And a similar sort of a thing, I live in Wales, and I have seen that as well, a sort of resurgence or a renaissance of Welsh, and how popular it is, among younger generations. And it is definitely something very exciting, and it can be done, exactly as you said.
Thank you so much for this enlightening discussion. Thank you, Hammad, for helming the ship, Jayson, May, Naima, for such thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye, Sabine. Thank you.
Bye.